Open up your eyes, it's all brand new. Every wish you make can still come true. I'm an old man, but I have wishes for you.
Hi folks, I'm Richard Duby and this is Think About It. My guest today is Elias Lieberman. Elias, first off, thank you very much for coming on. And you're a longtime resident of Falmouth, and you were also longtime rabbi at the Falmouth Jewish congregation.
That's right. Happy to be here, Richard.
How many years were you rabbi there?
I came to Falmouth in 1990 to assume that position,
Yeah.
and I retired in June of 24, so 34 years.
And do you miss it?
Aspects of it.
Yeah, huh?
I miss a great number of people.
Yeah.
There are aspects of the work which I was happy to set aside. I think the biggest piece of it for me by the time I was ready to retire had to do with a sense of emotional burden, feeling responsible for so many people in so many different ways. And I think some resentment was starting to build.
Really?
And I figured if I'm starting to feel that way, I'm not doing my congregants favors, I'm not
Sure.
doing myself any favors.
Now, rabbi, priest, in Roman Catholic, priest hears confession, even in other Christian denominations, priests serve as somebody that you go to during emotional times for advice. Do rabbis serve the same purpose?
I think most rabbis who serve congregations certainly do.
Yeah.
The general term is pastoral care.
Yeah.
You're taking care of people's needs as best you can. You're referring them on to experts should they need that. Hearing about their issues and concerns. So absolutely, that's part of it.
Without going into detail, of course, personal detail, the burdensome part of it, was it emotional?
It was emotional.
Yeah.
I think that I served a congregation of about 320 households, and that means families, couples, singles, so maybe a total of 500 to 600 individuals.
Okay.
Not all of them had need of me at any given point, but there were times when in a given week I might have 2 funerals, a counseling session, etc. And I think that by the time I was ready to retire, that had begun to feel burdensome in a way that I wasn't comfortable with.
Now, funerals, before we even get to that,
Sure.
how many Jewish congregations are there on the Cape?
There are essentially 3 established ones, that
Okay.
is to say, that have buildings and facilities.
Right.
So in Falmouth, there's the Falmouth Jewish congregation, which is part of the Reform movement within Judaism. In Hyannis, there's the Cape Cod Synagogue, also a Reform congregation. Hyannis also has a Chabad, the Orthodox group, which has a center there in Hyannis. And then further out the Cape in Eastham, there is a Chavurah, and that's a Hebrew word which means a fellowship. And they are affiliated with the Reform movement,
Okay.
but they're a little bit smaller. They meet in one of the churches in the area and have regular contact and regular events.
So, let's, for argument's sake, say there are basically 3 serving the entire Cape. So, Jewish congregants, if you had, how many would you say were?
320 households, so
Yes.
that might account for 500 or 600 individuals.
Okay. So you have 500 or 600 individuals who are, for lack of any other term, in your care, your pastoral care.
Yeah.
So marriages, deaths, bar mitzvahs, all fall on you. You're the guy
Right.
for all that.
Right.
So I can see where certainly the cycle of life is played out in 34 years, quite stridently. Birth, bar mitzvahs, deaths, weddings.
Right. That actually was one of the wonderful aspects of the work,
Yeah.
because over 34 years, I got to know people very well, those who
Okay.
wanted to be known by me.
Yeah.
And so I performed weddings for children who I did namings for when they were born.
Really.
I've done funerals for people who I've had known for 3 decades. So I think that was a wonderful trade-off.
Okay.
Some rabbis will go up the corporate ladder. They always want to serve a larger congregation. And then I think there's really diminishing returns.
Yeah.
They're just too many people, too much work, too many responsibilities.
Sure.
So I was in a sweet spot.
Let's go to basics.
Sure.
How would you define Judaism?
Basically, I'd start with Judaism being one of the three Abrahamic religions which the world recognizes: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all of whom trace their origins to this figure whose name was Abraham, as we are asked to believe, and the rest unfolds from that point forward. But what all three religions share in common is a belief in a God who mandated rules, behaviors, a course for humanity that, from God's perspective, would be the ideal way to shape society and constantly improve the world that we live in. So Judaism, I would say, is the earliest of those three. It is historically the oldest of those three religions.
So you're in the camp that Judaism is a religion as opposed to a nationality, an ethnicity.
That's where it gets complicated.
Okay.
Right. Judaism defines a Jew in a pretty narrow sense by this point in history. If you were born of a mother who was herself Jewish, you are, by Jewish legal definition, a Jew, regardless of whatever you do or don't do. If your parents fail to circumcise you, if you're a male, on the 8th day of your life, it doesn't invalidate your status as a Jew. If you never go through the experience of celebrating becoming a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah for a girl, it has nothing to do with your Jewish identity. You are a Jew, end of story. So that's a bottom line, and there are many Jews who are Jewish in that sense, and many Jews who would not acknowledge that as being Jewish. They would tell you, I'm not a Jew. Yeah, I was born a Jew, but I don't observe the rituals, I don't practice Jewish religious practice. So then you get into alternate understandings of what it means to be a Jew. There are Jews who so strongly identify with Jewish history, and part of that history is a history of being oppressed and having a heightened social justice conscience. For them, that is a way of living their Judaism. Some people call that social justice Judaism. There is arguably an ethnic component. That is to say, most Jews can trace their ancestry back genetically.
My point, yeah.
Right? There's an interesting case that evolved with anthropological studies in South Africa. There was a small African black nation within the borders of South Africa. I believe that the tribe was called the Lemba. I think it's L-E-M-B-A. They had a tradition of being descended from Jews, and these were black Africans. What was striking to anthropologists was that they seemed to have a division in their tribal structure which mirrored that of what you read about in the Bible, where ancient Israelites, precursors of the word for Jews, had a tier of a priestly class, a Levitical or an assistant priestly class, and then everybody else. This tribe had a similar structure and traditions which suggested that that was long-standing. So not much could be done with that. The theory was, well, they must have been influenced by Christian missionaries who came and brought the Bible, and this spoke to them, and they embraced that form of self-identification. Then we reached the era of genetic testing and DNA testing.
Right.
And when they tested the males in this tribe, they found, in fact, that a particular genetic marker, which is found among Jewish males and which points to a common male ancestor, was found in the same degree in this tribe, which said, well, we have to come up with a new theory. How is it that these people seem to have this genetic connection to Jews around the world who certainly are not black people? And their theory was, and it seems to have been borne out, that sometime maybe in the 16th century, Jewish traders who were sailing down the east coast of Africa from Jewish communities in Yemen may well have intermarried with natives in that part of South Africa and brought with them the Judaism and hence the genetic connection.
So, but the genetic connection, seeing as, if we go back BC, way BC. We all...
I'm going to jump in and give you a Jewish terminology.
Okay, go ahead.
Jews tend to use the term BCE. BC means before Christ.
Right.
And that's not a vantage point for understanding
Fine.
Jewish history.
Fine.
BCE is generally understood to mean before the Common Era, which
Okay.
starts with the year 1.
So, which, if we look at the Old Testament, Jesus is not even mentioned in the Old Testament by name. Am I correct?
Yes, but I'm going to suggest another alteration in our language. Old Testament is not a term that Jews use. Anything old implies that something new is inherently better.
Okay.
Right? All you have to do is look at any advertisements on TV, new and improved. Jews tend to use the terms either Hebrew Scriptures
Okay.
or Jewish Bible and avoid
Okay.
Old Testament.
Okay. This is going to sound strange. Are you aware of the comedian Louis Black?
Sure.
Okay. Louis Black constantly talks about Old Testament, New Testament, and how in the Old Testament God was always so angry, and in the New Testament he seemed to have mellowed out, and his comedic relief is maybe it was because he had a kid that, he sort of...
Well, if I were sitting here with Louis Black, we'd have an interesting discussion.
I know it. But that's Lewis's. So my other point was, genetically speaking, if you go to 23andMe and you find out, and you get tests, and you get your test results back, and you find out that you're 99.8% Ashkenazi, right? And there are a wealth of people out there who have a similar profile, 99.8% Ashkenazi. You can assume that that group of people who are 99.8% Ashkenazi have some common ancestry. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's generally true. But I also suspect that a great many of those people would not reach 98.9% because the reality is wherever Jews have lived, there has been intermarriage.
Right.
Sometimes not willingly, sometimes rape introduces different genes into a gene pool.
Right.
So there are many Jews who have a mosaic, you should pardon the pun, history genetically.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no denying that most of the world's Jews, and perhaps it'd be helpful to your viewers to clarify that term Ashkenazic. Those are Jews whose origin can be traced back to Eastern Europe, that part of the world. There are other major groupings in Judaism.
Sephardic.
Sephardic Jews, generally descended from Jews who spent time in Spain, but also populated North Africa.
Right.
And then there is Mizrahi. That term means Eastern. So Jews whose communities date to Arab countries, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, etc.
Okay.
But the point that I would get to make, but we can return to the genetic part if you wish, but what's also true about Judaism is that you need not be born a Jew to be a Jew. You can become a Jew. You can embrace Judaism. The term that's usually used is conversion.
Right. You and I had a brief discussion on this, and during the Crusades, Jews were as were other religions, were slaughtered if they didn't convert to Christianity. I was doing some reading, and there were a great number of Jews who committed suicide rather than convert because they were that devout and had no intentions of converting. So Judaism, in my mind, and I am not in any way offering a contrary argument to what you're saying, but Judaism, in my mind, Jews in general, to me, have been one of the only groups of people that I know of who are more defined by the outside world than they are the inside world, the world of Jews. And the example I'll give you is, and we talked about this, in 30s in Europe, when Hitler was on his rise to power, you could not convert out of Judaism to escape the camps. If you were a Jew, you were a Jew. It wasn't like the Crusades. You couldn't say, okay, I'm going to become a Christian, and you can escape the camps. The world didn't allow that. Certainly Nazi Germany didn't allow it, but the world seems to have always looked at Jews as a group apart. And which leads me, and you can go back to what you're going to say, what you're going to say later, but anti-Semitism is, I've heard this discussed, is the only prejudice that has never declined with the passing of time. There seems to be maybe some lulls for a while, and then a rebirth of anti-Semitism, and then maybe some lulls and a rebirth of anti-Semitism. It just seems to have been a fixture in the world for recorded history, certainly the recorded history of the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think that is? Why has it lasted this long?
Richard, I wish I had a good answer to that question. I mean, I sometimes think that a useful analogy is that of a virus. There are viruses which go dormant for long periods of time and then reemerge into a population and mutate. I think the nature of anti-Semitism is mutational. There's so many different forms of anti-Semitism, and it's taken so many different forms through history. You have anti-Semitism rooted in Christian theology. You have anti-Semitism rooted in the perception of the world is divided between Marxists and capitalists. You have ethnic hatred where people don't like the way you look. There's so many different aspects to it that I don't know that there's a single answer.
I guess what stimulated my question was Jews represent about 2%, a little less than 2% of the world's population. That's 98% of the world is comprised of non-Jews. Yet there is always this very strange theory out there that Jews are controlling so many aspects of what goes on in the world. And as opposed to declining, well, right now I think we're in, unfortunately, a rebirth of that. For instance, in Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us. In the United States, Jews are 0.2% of the population.
It suggests that there's something rational about anti-Semitism, and I think it's inherently irrational. So for those white young men in their preppy outfits to march through Charlottesville with torches saying Jews will not replace us, I don't think that any of them, given half a moment to think about it, actually think that there are enough Jews in the United States to replace them, whatever that means. They were borrowing Nazi terminology.
Sure.
I mean, that was a slogan of the Nazis.
I think what you're saying makes a good deal of sense. I think the bothersome part of that is that the rest of the country is not appalled by it. That the rest of the country is saying, you know what, as our present president said, there were some fine people down there. There were some bad people, there were some fine people down there. The country still feels that way. The country is divided along those lines. And I wouldn't even say it's 50-50. And I'm trying to figure out what it is that keeps stimulating. I appreciate your analogy of a virus, but something always causes a virus to be reborn.
I think when I reflect on the past 5-10 years, I think that a genie which more or less has been contained in a bottle was released.
Okay.
And with that, people felt incredible permission to verbalize their worst thoughts, and in some cases to actualize their worst desires.
Right, right.
And that wasn't only directed at Jews. It was directed at black people in this country. It was directed at the trans community, at gay, lesbian, bisexual people. And I am quite prepared to lay a lot of the blame for that at the feet of Donald Trump, who essentially modeled that behavior.
Yeah.
And people thought, well, wow, if he can do it, then I'm going to start saying what I want to say, or I'm going to start wearing my Proud Boys t-shirt or whatever it was.
Yeah.
So I think Jews have often been a convenient target in many cases because they've been very visible. Jews have been wonderfully successful in this society in particular, in media, in the movie industry, in popular entertainment. Not necessarily disproportionately so, but oftentimes identifiably so. Oh, that person's a Jew. Whereas you might not stop to think, well, is that person a Catholic? Is that person a Presbyterian, et cetera, et cetera? Yeah. So when there is anger or frustration, Jews have been easy and available targets. And that's been the case pretty much through Jewish history. But I want to come back to the the comment that you made, which touched on Jews being separate. I think that there's a reality behind that, in that the way Judaism traditionally was understood and practiced for many, many centuries before the modern era, when different expressions of Judaism began to evolve, liberal movements within Judaism.
Right.
To live in a Jewish community meant that you were, by definition, living a separate existence.
How so?
One of the significant rules of traditional Jewish observance are the dietary laws. There are certain foods which are forbidden to Jews to eat, anything from a pig, shellfish, etc. And the mixing of dairy and meat in the same meal, forbidden. These are rules which are rooted in the Torah, in the Hebrew Bible. And Jews who are observant observe those all the time. Well, what that means is that if your neighbor who is not a Jew and who is roasting a delicious suckling pig invites you over for a barbecue, you can't, right? As much as you might want to have wonderful relations with your neighbors, there are dividing lines. And the Jewish understanding is those are boundaries which preserve the essence of Judaism. And to violate them is to risk Judaism becoming diluted, disappearing, etc.
Your congregation, were the predominance of your congregation keeping kosher homes?
Absolutely not.
No.
My congregation is part of a movement in Judaism called Reform Judaism.
Yeah.
Started in Germany in the late 1700s, early 1800s, was transported to this country by German Jewish immigrants in the early, mid-1800s. And one of the principles of Reform Judaism that we give ourselves permission to look at the Bible in particular with a critical eye and to understand it in view of scientific understanding, scientific advancements, all the amazing work that evolved in the 19th and 20th centuries in linguistics, in anthropology, archaeology. All of it brought us new information through which we could view the Bible. So you can look at the sections in the Bible which talk about the forbidden animals, and you can come up with theories. Why did our ancestors feel that?
Yeah.
Were they aware on some level that you might have an increased risk of trichinosis if you eat pork? Probably not. But they were boundaries. They helped define Jews as over and apart from their neighbors. Of course, the understanding was that was what God desired of them.
Yeah.
Reform Judaism says, in essence, what's less important than what goes into your mouth is what comes out of your mouth with your speech. So there are generations of Jews who set aside those traditional dietary laws. I grew up in a Reform household. I grew up eating all of the delights that Baltimore, Maryland had to offer, steamed crabs, bacon, the works. I didn't grow up in a kosher home.
Yeah.
As I became an adult, I decided to take on certain religious disciplines, including keeping kosher.
Okay.
But that became easier and easier for me as I got closer and closer to being a vegetarian, which I've now been for about 15 years. You don't have to worry about those issues.
Yeah.
The point being that very few people in my congregation keep kosher, but there are many who do, because as you may know, when it gets to Passover each year, you have to avoid any leavened products. You can't eat bread. Well, Jews who observe Passover and avoid bread, they're keeping a form of kosher, at least for that 7 or 8 day period.
Yeah.
So it's a little tricky to say, do you keep kosher or not? But certainly not in the way that traditionally.
As an aside, I will tell you a quick story. Many, many years ago, we lived across the street from a family who had a 14-year-old boy. Jewish family had a 14-year-old boy. He didn't get along with his family, so I more or less raised him. He is now 64 years old, and we are still very, very close. But when he was a teenager, his best friend, he was a bookworm, not an athlete at all. His best friend was the top athlete in their high school, and he was black. And they were inseparable. They went to college, and his best friend's name was Weldon. And Weldon converted to Judaism. Cut to the end of this story, Weldon will not eat at Rabbi's house because Weldon keeps a kosher home and Rabbi doesn't. Now, as I said, they're best friends, but they just live in these two separate worlds.
Well, there's a piece of evidence of perhaps
exactly
the diminishment of anti-Semitism.
Yes, but it also points to what you were talking about before. When I ask what a Jew is, if you speak to Weldon, Weldon is as Jewish as any Jew in the world, to Weldon, and that's all that matters.
And I think in the
But he was
conversation,
not born a Jew.
in the conversation you and I had earlier, I tend to be on the end of the spectrum which says that the definition of who is a Jew really resides with the individual
Yeah,
Jew.
okay.
Right? There's
Okay.
so many ways to manifest Judaism.
Okay, so you mentioned Abraham. Now, in my readings, Judaism basically starts with the conversation between God and Abraham. I mean, that's an oversimplification.
Well, that's certainly what the tradition, the biblical tradition, has us understand.
Right.
But that presupposes that you're prepared to suspend your disbelief in historicity
Yes.
in
Well,
order to accept a biblical message which reflects what our ancestors believed or wished to believe.
Okay.
There's no historical evidence that we can uncover at this point in time that points to an individual who was actually named Abraham. He might be a composite figure.
The
But it
Hebrew-
all starts with that call to Abraham.
The Hebrew book was written by who? What our audience refers to as the Old Testament
Sure.
was written by who?
Well, I think we need to understand that for a very long time it was a collection of oral traditions.
Started basically when?
When people want to date the possibility of a real Abraham, they would date him to the 18th century BCE.
Okay.
So about 2,000 years before Jesus comes on the scene.
Okay.
And over time, particularly Genesis is understood to be the earliest layer of the Hebrew Bible. And its material is no older than that. But, you know, I'm not enough of a scholar to parse that out for
No,
you.
but we'll get into what you and I had talked about previously, in that Noah was mentioned in Genesis. Am I correct in that?
Noah predates the Abraham story,
Yes.
sure.
Okay, so we are people live their lives by the stories that are told in this book. So rational people are not going to accept, or maybe they do accept, Noah and the flood and God allowing Noah and his family to be spared. But there are so many contradictory facts. In essence, if Noah and his family were the only human beings alive after the flood, after everything had been destroyed, then everything else is the result of incest.
The problem, Richard, is that even the Bible itself has contradictions as part of it. There are statements, there are historical snippets which contradict one another. And I think the problem is when people turn to the Bible and assume that it is a historical record.
Okay.
The Bible, certainly as I understand it, is a compendium of many, many things. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, were created over a long period of time, over centuries. And they reflect not history per se, but how our ancestors, whoever shaped those stories and eventually set them down in a written form, how they understood their world, how that world came into being. They were influenced by and not unaware of other ancient Middle Eastern societies in the ancient Near East. So you have stories that you find in the Bible which are in many ways parallel to those you find in ancient Babylonian society.
Mm-hmm.
I think a good example would be the Tower of Babel story, right? Fascinating story. It purports to explain why we all have different languages and how we got scattered over the face of the earth. Well, archaeologists, probably in the 19th century, began to discover in Iraq these stepped temples, pyramids, but stepped.
Yeah.
And they said, well, wow, that might very well be the source of that Tower of Babel story. The belief that you ascend to the top of this and you're in closer proximity to the gods who dwell above. So that kind of information begins to enable one to see the Bible in a different way. There may be snippets of history, but it's also theology, theological assertions, myths, humor.
But if we fast forward, if we can, and we go to the story of Jesus. And we're gonna overlap into anti-Semitism here, because I grew up in a time when Jews were referenced as Christ killers. Without Jesus, without the story of Jesus, there is no Christ killer myth. So the insertion of the story of Jesus into not only our society, but societies around the world, seems to have been, in my mind, and please correct me if you feel I'm wrong, at the seat of a huge portion of anti-Semitism, because there was the world before Jesus, and then there was the world after Jesus. And the world after Jesus is populated much more densely by adherents than the world before Jesus, the world of the Jews before Jesus.
Well, one thing is it presupposes that there was no anti-Jewish sentiment before Jesus, and that's not the case.
No, well, we knew that in
was
Egypt held them as slaves.
Well, if you believe that to be a true story, right? I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that's part of the core foundational myth of Judaism, right?
Okay.
That we were slaves, our
Interesting.
ancestors were slaves in Egypt.
Yeah.
God freed us. People don't usually take the next step and say, well, why did God free them? Well, the Torah gives the answer. God freed them so that they could be now not enslaved, but servants to God and do God's bidding as communicated through Moses when they get to Mount Sinai.
Was that not, though, somewhat the same story as God's conversation with Abraham? Because he was telling him to kill his son. And he was willing to do that for God. And when God realized he was willing to do it, God said, you don't have to do it. But it's that conversation which says that man, I'm looking for a word here, not subservient. Man is under the auspices of a God. That God at that particular point in time who spoke to Abraham. Is that not?
Well, it's a complex story, and you'll get many different interpretations of whether Abraham passed or failed that test. Some would say he failed the test by being prepared to slaughter his son. Others would say he passed the test when he was prepared to do God's bidding and had enough faith to believe that God would not allow him to go through with it.
Yeah.
So to this day, it's fodder for sermons every time that passage comes up. That's why I guess I consider myself freed from the obligation to view those passages in the Torah as defining.
Okay.
There are horrible things in the Torah, in the Bible, which appear to have a God who's demanding that in fighting our enemies, we smash their children's heads against rocks.
Sure.
Right? Or we put gay people to death.
But then how do you personally relate to the Torah?
Well, as I said, I see it as the foundational beginnings of Judaism. I'll give you a quote attributed to a Reform rabbi. I'm blanking on his name. Solomon Freehoff. He was a well-known 20th century rabbi in Pittsburgh. He said, we give the tradition a vote, but not a veto. Meaning, anything in Jewish history, all of the traditions, the rabbinic writings, all of the decisions, we should know them, we should understand them.
Yeah.
But they don't have a claim on us that is exclusive.
Okay. I'm just looking, we have a clock here and it just gives me some idea of how much time. So unfortunately, I have to move away from this present discussion because I want to talk about two sermons that you gave. And before we get into the sermons, they were given on the High Holy Days. They were given on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. A lot of our audience might not know the significance of those two holidays. So could you just give us a brief description
Absolutely.
of the two?
Both of those holidays are mandated in the Bible. Mm-hmm. Rosh Hashanah, Hebrew words which mean the head or the beginning of the year. Yom Kippur, which comes 10 days after Rosh Hashanah, is understood to mean the Day of Atonement. So the Jewish calendar is complicated, but at a certain point in time, the Jewish calendar year was shifted from spring, the spring month when Passover happens, to a month in the fall. So the Jewish calendar year begins each fall. The Hebrew calendar floats back and forth with respect to the secular calendar, but Rosh Hashanah is always going to be either in September or October, and the same holds for Yom Kippur.
Okay.
They are probably, in most Jewish minds, the most significant holidays.
And when you say Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, just go into that term, atonement.
Sure. Some people break the word down and say you can divide it into at-one-ment, meaning it is a day in which we reflect on our behaviors and presumably our failures in the year that now draws to a close, and resolve to do better in the new year, that we have an opportunity to confess our sins to God, confess our failings to our fellow human beings. But the tradition's very clear. There's no point in asking God for forgiveness for something you've done to another person unless you have first tried to set it right with that person.
When you say your sins,
sin is a word that's very laden, mostly from Christian understanding.
Yes.
So the word in Hebrew is generally used as the word chet. Chet is a term connected to archery, and it means to miss the target.
Okay.
So if our intention is straight, but we go wide of the mark, that's a transgression. Transgression, going off the path, right? So the idea is constantly to live a life that gets us back on track, headed towards the target.
Okay.
So that's what Yom Kippur is about. We take stock of the things we feel badly about. We try to undo them when possible. That's a prerequisite for asking forgiveness. And that's why it's such a significant day.
So you are basically asking God for forgiveness at that point in time?
Well, for things between you and God, yes.
Okay.
But if I have been really lousy to my spouse and have been abusive, or I failed to take note of her needs, I have to make myself aware of it, seek to undo harm that I may have done, and then seek her apology.
Now, brings us to another important point.
Her forgiveness, excuse me.
Yes. Another important point. Jews and heaven and hell. That's my serve.
Sure.
Now you
so
volley.
I gave a sermon once in which I used a wonderful tale. A samurai swordsman comes to a Shinto priest and says, "Teach me about heaven." And he says, "Huh, teach you? You've got that little butter knife by your side?" And the samurai gets enraged, draws his sword, and is about to strike the priest dead. And he says to him, "That's hell." He puts the sword away. He says, "That's heaven."
Okay. It's not the clear cut.
Right. Judaism does not share, for example, with parts of Christianity, because Christianity is marvelously broad, many different understandings of all those concepts. But the traditional understanding of hell as a place of eternal punishment and heaven as a place of eternal reward is not that clear-cut in Judaism.
Yeah.
Judaism does assert that all of us have something other than our body, and they call it a soul. In Hebrew word, neshama. There are different ways to describe it, but something of us that survives the body, transcends death.
Okay.
Our bodies die, our bodies decompose, but something, Judaism asserts, as does Christianity and Islam, something returns to its source, which Judaism says is God.
Okay.
Well, the rabbis in the post-biblical period, who really are responsible for shaping much of what we understand Judaism to be today, they sort of elaborated on that, and they posited, they speculated that when the body dies and the soul is freed from the body, the soul will appear before God and be judged based on what that soul did or did not do when it was inhabiting a body.
Yeah.
There may be punishment, but Judaism never suggested that that punishment would mean eternal separation from God. It might be time limited. But it just didn't get florid in its description. No lakes of fire, no tormenting demons, etc.
Yeah. Which brings me into the next segment. Your Rosh Hashanah sermon on September 13th of 2007. Part of it, you say, what has become clear to me over the decades is that I have never fully plumbed the depths of my own beliefs about God and about the nature of belief itself. Give us a little, I once again, because of the limitations of time, this is a treatise, more or less, both of these sermons, on atheism. And let's start off with what I just asked you, though. That statement, what has become clear to me over the decades is that I have never fully plumbed the depths of my own beliefs about God.
So 2007, I was ordained in 1984, so that's 23 years into my career as a rabbi.
Mm-hmm.
When day in, day out, week after week, I'm leading services with liturgy, which are just chock full of references to God and prayers addressed to a divine being. And I had come to an awareness by that point that, A, I had no clear memory of what I was taught about God when I was a child, even into my teenage years when I moved through religious education. I don't remember when I finally made the decision, and how old was I when I entered rabbinical school? I was 31. I don't remember in my 5 years of study in seminary all that much conversation about the nature of belief. In other words, how do you come to believe what Judaism asks you to believe?
Mm-hmm.
It was sort of an assumption that, oh, you're going to be a rabbi, you're going to be a Jewish educator, you must have some certain core beliefs. And so I went through my training and I accepted my first position and then moved on and came here to Falmouth. And it slowly dawned on me that I never really grappled with what I do believe and what I do not believe. Now, it so happened that around 2007, and I make reference to this in those sermons, a series of books were published by a number of well-known atheists, Christopher Hitchens,
Dawkins.
Richard Dawkins, right. And they got a lot of press, a lot of pushback, but they also opened a lot of eyes.
I think, let me just interject here.
Sure.
You have to tell our audience the role of a rabbi is that of almost of a teacher. They are expected to read. They are expected to question. They are the, I want to say this without offending anybody else, but amongst the clergy of the world, they are expected to be the ones you can turn to, not just for answers of the soul, but historical references, more than just questions about God.
Well, yes, I wouldn't deny any of that. But I think what's important to note is that the traditional definition of a rabbi, and this holds true in Orthodox Judaism,
Right.
to a certain extent in conservative, but less so the further to the progressive end of the Jewish spectrum you get, a rabbi is someone who is trained in Jewish law. And that means that if you come to me, Richard, and you say, you know, I want to have this chicken for my Sabbath meal Friday night, but I'm not sure that it's a kosher chicken.
Right.
That rabbi is, in theory, supposed to be able to determine, is this animal kosher, fit for consumption or not? If I come and say, Rabbi, I'm having a dispute with my neighbor, I claim he owes me this, he claims he doesn't, I need you to adjudicate for us. That was a traditional role for a rabbi.
Right.
It's not what I did with my time. By the time I come along and I grow up as a Reform Jew, I become a Reform rabbi. Some of what you described is what I was involved in. I was expected to have a certain amount of knowledge about things Jewish,
Right.
or to know where to find the answers if a congregant posed me a question to which I didn't have an answer, and that was not infrequent.
Mm-hmm.
So knowing where to turn for knowledge, that's part of it.
Okay.
And all of that over and above the so-called pastoral work.
Further on in that particular sermon, you say, the High Holy Days liturgy, with its emphasis on a sovereign God of infinite awareness and supreme judgment, has become an irritant to my soul. You have to.
Sure. Well, by that point in time, it was clear to me that I was doing something performative each time I stood up to lead a service.
As opposed to?
Being emotionally and spiritually engaged with those prayer statements.
Okay.
All right?
Okay.
So it's one thing to praise God as the source of healing, and it's a different thing to assume that there is a God who hears my particular prayer that my dear friend with ALS is going to be miraculously healed.
Right.
All right? I never believed in that latter kind of God.
Okay, so this is sort of compounding now as you go along, and you follow that by saying a National Harris poll, which revealed that just 30% of Jews surveyed said that they are absolutely certain there is a God. That means 70% were not sure. This compares to 75% for Protestants and 64% for Catholics. Now, there's a difference between being agnostic and being an atheist.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? For simplistic explanations, agnostic is you're not quite sure. An atheist is saying, making a definitive statement that there is no God that fits this description.
Mm-hmm. Which is why, in one or both of those sermons, I prefer to use the word mystery with a capital M.
Okay.
In other words, I say that for me, God is the sum total of everything I do not understand and never will understand in my limited lifespan about the nature of the universe, about the nature of existence, all of it. But that's okay. It doesn't trouble me. I don't need to have that belief to live a fulfilling life as a Jew. And I think what that statistic about Jewish non-belief points to is that Judaism is a way of living a life which does not demand of you belief per se, but it does demand of you behaviors.
Fine, so we get to the topic of faith.
Mm-hmm.
And once again, I think I even said it to you. Faith, by definition, is the absence of fact. So a sentient human being, knowing what we now know about the universe and knowing what we don't know about the universe, relies on faith, meaning I'll be satisfied with the absence of fact. And an atheist, and once again, your term atheism, an atheist is saying, I really am more comfortable with fact than I am simply with faith. Faith is being, organized religion is almost being comfortable with what you don't know, whereas atheism seems to be really irritated by what you don't know and wanting to know it.
Well, I think organized religion, in my mind, in many, if not most cases, points to an answer, that answer being a supreme being, a God, whose ways are inscrutable, and in the face of that, we simply have to have faith that what happens is what God wants to have happen.
So what we don't know is
what can hurt us.
Exactly. And you said, once again, and this must have been, excuse my expression, one hell of a sermon. I mean, you say President George Bush.
People got some good sleep during it.
No way. President George Bush, the senior, is on record suggesting that one cannot be a true American and an atheist.
With due respect for former President Bush, I think that's just a ridiculous thing to say.
Yeah, okay. Belief in the supernatural. Anything that I am stating right now is from the, I almost said the rabbi's sermon, 2 sermons. Belief in the supernatural, that is an affirmation of a supreme being who controls every aspect of creation, is aware of everything we think, say, and do, is able to hear and respond to prayer. This is more of the irritant that you were talking about before? Or?
It's such a fundamental assumption in society at large that that's the nature of reality.
Okay.
That there's a God that defines it and controls it and shapes it. And irritant might be too strong a word, but I have no need of that concept. And I think some of the atheist writers make a pretty compelling case that that kind of belief has causes problems and has caused problems.
I think this is a quote that I used, but I think it's your quote. You said, religion's fundamental teaching that we should be fully satisfied with not understanding what our minds are capable of understanding. That's you talking. That's not somebody else. So basically, yeah, you are not a person of mere faith.
No, I wouldn't self-describe that way. But you know, my job as the rabbi of Falmouth Jewish congregation for those 34 years was to try to get people to think along with me. And that sometimes means thinking the opposite of what I think. So I did take a certain risk in sharing those sermons with the congregation. But by that point in my career, I felt I needed to do it. They had to have a deeper understanding of who their rabbi is and what he believes and does not believe. I was pretty certain I was not going to get fired after giving those 2 sermons. I did not get fired.
Would it be fair to say of you that you are more avidly seeking not arguments, but yes, an argument as opposed to a convert? A sound argument, not just simply an irrational argument.
I have no need or desire to persuade other people to embrace what I believe.
Does Judaism?
There are so many things in Judaism that I think are worth embracing.
No, but does Judaism seek converts?
Judaism welcomes converts. There's a different, that's different. And
Different.
But there were periods in Jewish history when Judaism actively sought converts.
There was.
Oh yes. There are estimates that in the Roman era there might have been as many as 10 million Jews in the broader Mediterranean era. Early Christians were also seeking converts. There were pagan cults which were seeking converts.
Right.
There was a lot of competition for souls.
I guess I'm talking about the modern era.
Well, the modern era really reflects the growth of anti-Semitism.
Okay.
And it became dangerous in certain places and times to even welcome someone who is desirous of becoming a Jew. And hence, you know, the so-called tradition of a rabbi refusing 3 times to allow somebody to study to become a Jew, that really reflects the fear and the danger that was involved, because oftentimes they were setups.
We hear very frequently now, well, not just now, in recent memory, that America is a Christian nation.
Well, at least 1 or 2 of those writers makes a pretty compelling case that the founding fathers themselves were, they might have been theists, but they might not have been believers in the traditional God that the Bible talks about.
Okay, going on in your sermon. As long as we accept the principle that religious faith must be respected simply because it is religious faith, it is hard to withhold respect from the faith of Osama bin Laden and the suicide bombers. That is a statement that is laden. It's fraught with danger. I mean, you make a statement in any way that doesn't condemn Osama bin Laden or those who participated in 9/11. And this makes sense to me. But did you realize how it was going to be received when you?
Well, you know, I think that thoughtful people, especially if they have some sense of the history of the world, will understand that the same kind of fanaticism that drove ISIS and Osama bin Laden was present in the conquistadors who destroyed civilizations in Central America, was certainly behind the Crusades in Europe, which slaughtered Jews and Muslims indiscriminately.
How about what happened to the indigenous people in North America?
Absolutely. Now, that wasn't always necessarily in the name of religion per se. Sometimes it was in the nature of desire for westward expansion and pushing those railroads through.
Someday you and I will sit down with coffee and or tea, and I don't fully agree with that. I think that a lot of that was white Christians just having a born view of people with different color skin who spoke a different language, had different traditions. Fear.
See, and I think that's what enabled them to do what they did, saying we're doing this, you know, for their own good, in the name of God, and to save their souls.
Okay. It is our tolerance, Dawkins suggests, that is getting us in trouble, and our inclination to say your belief is as legitimate and worthy of respect and tolerance as mine, notwithstanding the reality that others' belief may require young girls to undergo genital mutilation or gay men to be crushed to death, or prevent women from voting, driving a car, or even showing their faces in public. So,
well, here we are in 2025, and some of these things are raising their ugly head again, even in our own society.
right. So, how do you put a speedometer on religious tolerance?
Well, I think what's the part of a car that governs the speed? A governor. There's a governor and an engine, right?
There is, if you
Well,
want to say it, yeah.
I think that that's what the wall of separation between church and state, that was its function, and it's being dismantled.
I don't see, I shouldn't say, I don't have a working knowledge of every society in the world, but of certainly the Western societies, I don't see any society that adheres to that. I mean, their tolerance seems to be inbred, intolerance rather, seems to be inbred in Western societies right now, all of them.
I wouldn't limit it to Western societies at all.
No,
We have
I wouldn't,
terrible-
but I'm just saying that those are the ones that most Americans relate to. I mean, if you speak to the average American, they can probably tell you something about Italy or Germany or France, but ask them to say something about any of the countries in the East. Ask them to talk about India. Nothing they can tell you about India.
Right.
So Western countries, intolerance in Western countries is sometimes, in some countries, at an all-time high.
Absolutely. Look at Hungary. There's a perfect example.
Yes.
For me, the only consolation I can sometimes find is in understanding that history has peaks and troughs, and it might be that we just be on the slippery slope of the next historical trough.
One faction, itself composed of mutually warring factions, has the sheer arrogance to tell us that we already have all the essential information we need. So we have a faction, a religious faction, that tells us faith is the way to go. You have all the information that you need, which boggles my mind, but if you're confused, simply ask God. And
Well, there are other ways that happens. So, for example, in the Catholic Church, the Pope has that unique role of, in a sense, being an intermediary between the faithful and God.
okay,
So, and is thereby empowered to make decisions or to create policies which affect all self-identifying Catholics. You have, the horrible example, I think, of the Ayatollahs in Iran, right, who look to religion and scripture and their belief and impose it in the worst ways, which leads to the worst kind of human degradation and violence. Fortunately, there's no parallel to that in the United States. There is no official church. There's no theologian who is mandating belief or practice in this country.
well, we have a president who is attempting to do that right now.
But not from a vantage point of religious belief,
Oh.
right? He's not using religion, despite the Trump Bible, which you can buy for $60 or whatever. He's not using that. And of course, the supreme irony is that he is such a terrible example of upholding the kinds of values that most people associate with God's desires as expressed in the Bible. Treating others as you wish to be treated, concern for the poor, the needy, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So to the extent that there are many evangelical Christians who see him as the flawed deliverer that God is sending.
Okay.
And for him to have had the audacity to suggest that he's anointed by God,
I know.
it's a pretty strong case for atheism in my book.
Now, I have to ask you a question.
Sure.
First up. There's a lot more I want to talk about here. I want to get a commitment from you to come back for a second show because we simply will not have the time to go into the rest of it.
Let's see what kind of feedback I get from this one. In principle, absolutely.
Okay. I guess what I'm asking is the Torah is a touchstone for basically for guidance in certain situations. With your knowledge of the Torah, is there anything that overlaps into, forget the Israeli-Gaza situation for a moment, that overlaps into the condition of humankind, Jews and non-Jews, that would insert a rational thought based on teachings of the Torah that would say that we're human beings and
Well, see, I'll go back to the point I made earlier. The Torah is so many things and contains so many messages, some of which are contradictory.
okay.
So you have the very fundamental chapter 1 of Genesis, right? Human beings are created in God's image. From that flows the teaching that every single human being has what Judaism calls the spark of the divine in them. And that our job is, even with the most reprehensible person, to understand that we share something in common with them, right? It's really a challenge when you see despicable people
Sure.
to understand that they too are part of what God created. So, well,
Yeah.
that's a humanistic teaching, right?
That's what
But
I'm
then-
asking. Yeah.
But then you also have in the Torah terrible commands about how you should destroy your enemy, be ruthless. But again, I don't think one can read the Torah, for example. If you just pick it up and read from Genesis to Deuteronomy, you're selling yourself short, because the history of Judaism is all about the interpretation of that
Okay.
material. And that is manifold. It just goes off in so many different directions, which can be frustrating, but also enables anyone to find a place on the spectrum of understanding and belief and action that for them is an authentic Jewish voice and an authentic Jewish mandate.
Have you visited Israel?
I lived in Israel for 2 different years, 1 year of college and then my first year of rabbinical studies.
Is there a feeling of homeland that was stimulated in you when you got there?
It was very moving to live there.
Yeah.
I did feel my sense of Jewish identity heightened and deepened.
Mm-hmm.
I was there the year of the Yom Kippur War in 1973,
Yeah.
and I had some formative experiences as a volunteer, which reminded me that there, but by the grace of my great-grandparents' decision to leave the Ukraine and come to America, I might have ended up as one of the soldiers that I was assisting in a hospital in Jerusalem.
Yeah, yeah.
So, yes, it's a special place.
But there's a sense of place for you?
Yes, but not in the sense that it's some place that I ever considered living, making my home. I am proud to be an American. I'm ashamed of a great deal of what America does, but it's my job to be part of that effort to make America constantly better.
Right.
And I get that from my Judaism.
Wonderful. Well, as I said, you're going to review this program, and you're going to see whether you'd be willing to come back, because this was just the Rosh Hashanah sermon that we covered. We haven't even gotten.
Boy,
Thank you so much for coming.
thank you, Richard. It was a pleasure.
That's it, folks. I hope you enjoyed this edition of Think About It. Keep in mind that all of the editions of Think About It can be found on YouTube. All you have to do is search for Think About It, Richard Duby. We are on here every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. But in the meantime, sit back and think about it.
Open up your eyes, it's all brand new. Every wish you make can still come true. I'm an old man, but I have wishes